hard to find biblical support for this because very few things in the Bible happen in church. Even in Matthew, who at least uses the word that we translate church, ecclesia, Jesus is usually doing things somewhere else. Teaching and preaching on the mount, he's by the sea, he is calling disciples in places where they work. In fact, there really wasn't a Christian church in Jesus' day. Not only that, there really weren't any Christians. Jesus did go to synagogue, but he didn't spend much time there, and when he did, he seemed to basically get into trouble. So, is negativity the only kind of thing that we can get from the Bible? I mean, just because nothing really happens that much in church, is there any positive thing that we can see that would be a, kind of a background and support for why we might do things in different spaces than a church building? We could look at the Old Testament prophets, and probably don't have time to do too much with that, but to think about those prophets which, even though Isaiah had that marvelous vision in the temple where the gold seraphs at the altar began to fly, remember, 2, they covered their faces, and 2, they covered their feet, and we think that probably wasn't really their feet that they were covering, like this. But other than that amazing vision in the temple, Isaiah spent a lot of his time walking around the marketplace and seeing what was going on there. How the faithful city has become a whore, he wrote. She that was full of justice, righteousness lodged in her, but now murderers. Everyone loves a bribe and runs after gifts. Thank heavens that doesn't happen anymore. They do not defend the orphan, and the widow's cause does not come before them. Jeremiah too. He had a hard time with the temple. But he spent a lot of time out in the marketplace. And he doesn't only go places to condemn people. He goes places to learn from them. Remember when he went down to the potter's house? The word of the Lord came to Jeremiah, "Come, go down to the potter's house, and there I will let you hear my words." So Jeremiah says, I went down to the potter's house, and there he was working at his wheel. The vessel he was making of clay was spoiled in the potter's hand, and he reworked it into another vessel that seemed good to him. You see, he's actually paying attention. He's paying attention to what he sees in this location. It's not, in a sense, a sacred space, if you define sacred as where the Shekinah of God had come to rest, but it was we might call it a secular space, but he was seeing there something that made him hear the word of God. Then the word of the Lord came to me, he says, "Can I not do with you, O house of Israel, just as this potter has done? Just like the clay in the potter's hand, so are you in my hand, O house of Israel." So these prophets didn't spend much time in the designated holy places, but they found holiness in a lot of other places. One of my favorites is the prophet Ezekiel, who had a lot of wild kinds of visions. He has a vision about the temple, but he wasn't in the temple. Do you remember this? A wonderful vision in Ezekiel 47. He's standing outside. His guide has brought him to the door, to the very threshold of the temple, and water is flowing out underneath the door of the temple. And it sounds a little bit like that old song about the boa constrictor. I'm being swallowed by a boa constrictor. It's up to my ankles, up to my knees, up to my hips. You didn't go to church camp, it's obvious. But this, he walks in the water and it's up to his ankles. He measures 1,000 cubits and it's up to his knees. Then it's up to his waist. And then the water is a great river. And he can't walk through it. And this water, this is the wondrous thing about this water. This is a river flowing under the temple door. And he looks on either side of the river. The banks are full of trees. And the leaves are for healing. This is the vision that's picked up later in the book of very end of Revelation. And there the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations, which we surely would pray would happen now. And then Ezekiel says this wondrous thing about this river that is flowing under the door of the temple out into the world, and everything will live where the river goes. I have often hoped myself that that's a view of the church, a vision of the church, that everything, when we flow out of church on Sunday morning or whenever it is that we worship, that everything will live where that river goes. But what about Jesus? Jesus had some harsh things to say about the temple, including last Sunday. Right? Were you preaching on that text from Mark? Do you see these grand buildings, Jesus said? Oh, because the disciples were so impressed with the size of them. Not one stone will be left upon another, for all will be thrown down. So it happened that the people did not have to imagine thinking outside the walls, because soon the walls were gone. So this is where we enter, and then we have to think, how did the early church come to be? I mean, how did it get formed? Did Jesus simply say, well, let me just give you one possible rendition of a master narrative. And this is goes something like this, and you might not say it this way. Jesus passed down his message to his apostles, and they in turn passed it down to the church fathers, bishops, theologians, saints, and he does mean fathers here. These church fathers received the essence of Jesus' message and put it in the form of several creeds that capture the Christian essence for all time. The essentials of Christian practice were also transmitted in the sacraments of communion and baptism. In this way, Christianity today has a direct authority from God and Jesus. That's the master narrative in a sense that I grew up with. I mean, I don't think they said it this way at Zion Lutheran Church in Gowrie, Iowa, but there was a kind of master narrative that made sense, and then it began to kind of crack open. When I went to seminary, which wasn't 100 years ago, but it was about 40 years ago, in my biblical classes, I heard very little about the Roman Empire. Okay? I mean, I knew that a decree went out from Caesar Augustus, and I knew that he was Roman, and so was Pilate. I mean, we kind of knew those things, but now, those of you who just graduated from seminary now, or just a few years ago, almost all New Testament scholarship is through the lens of the Roman Empire, or opposition to the Roman Empire. This is a big change. When you read Paul's letters, not just about individual salvation, but about resistance to the Roman Empire, you begin to hear these readings in a completely new way. One of the things that, as I was thinking particularly about this gathering, was the increased interest very recently in Greco-Roman meals, Hellenistic meal practices in the first 2 centuries. Now you may think, oh, boring. This is like startling news, really, to me. I mean, and one of the people that's done a lot of work on it is someone that lives right in Philadelphia, Hal Towsett, who was one of my colleagues at Union. And there's a whole group now in the Society for Biblical Literature that studies these early meals. They weren't early Christian meals, they were just early meals that were people gathered in associations according to craftspeople or ethnic groups gathered. And now there's this amazing study that has opened up how the church probably was formed. It wasn't formed in terms of this master narrative where Jesus handed down teachings to the apostles, then to the church fathers, then into the creeds, and so now we have a kind of neat package forever. It was much more exciting, interesting, confusing, chaotic. Karen King, who is teaches New Testament, I think she still is at Harvard, says this: what happens if we tell the story differently from this master narrative? What if the beginning was a time of grappling and experimentation? What if the meaning of the gospel was not clear and Christians struggled to understand who Jesus was? It's a different way of looking at how what we call the church came to be. I would add another question specifically related to our theme here these few days. What if the early followers of Jesus asked questions and experimented with these new ways of living within the framework of secular supper clubs? That's really what they were. They may have had, invocations to various gods, but they weren't churches. And they weren't seders. They were secular gatherings that had a certain kind of order to them. And I suppose that we could even say that these believers and wanderers, these sages and doubters who were part of this early movement of Jesus' followers, were doing something akin to pub theology. And I say that not to say, oh, I've got to get pub theology in here somehow. But pubs already exist, right? Maybe your church creates a pub, I don't know. But there are some churches that are making beer, I know, but at least in Minnesota. They are making beer, but the pub is a kind of, in a sense, secular place, institution, gathering. That's what these supper clubs were, that early Christ followers began to use this form that was already established to experiment with what it would mean to worship, to follow, to believe in a crucified criminal who they now believed had risen from the dead. So this was a matter of struggle and grappling with things that they didn't quite yet have figured out. But just listen to a description. You can read books and books. Hal's book is called In the Beginning Was the Meal. It's a very interesting book. Not in the beginning was the word, but in the beginning was the meal. And so one of the things that he describes, and this is work based on many, many others, and he's very humble in acknowledging people like Dennis Smith and Matthias Klinghardt, who also have done a lot of work in this field. So this is what a Greco-Roman meal would look like. And as you hear this description, just see if you hear echoes of other things. Reclining. This is not how the Last Supper happened, with all 12 people plus Jesus sitting on one side of a table. Robin Williams had this wonderful comedy piece where the disciples and Jesus, no place was open, so they went to a Chinese restaurant on Passover, and the host said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I have only one table over there by the river, but you all have to sit on the same side." So it's not, the people didn't sit at chairs, they were reclining. So you have to picture, this is how these supper clubs were. Usually it was men, although there were instances where there were also women. Very interesting, there also was experimentation where slaves and non-slaves were at the same meal, reclining together. It didn't mean that it changed who they were outside that banquet, but when they were in there, they imagined a different kind of world. This is all happening at these Greco-Roman meals. These weren't Christian meals. These were Hellenistic meals. There was a certain order, and it was almost always the same. There was the supper, and then there was, in transition, a libation to the gods, to Apollo, to perhaps a local deity. Sometimes there were many, many toasts or libations to the gods. And that happened after the supper and before the symposium, because that was really the long part of the supper, was something called the symposium. And that was, there could be any kind of thing going on, but lots of discussion was probably where Paul's letters would have been read, if anybody could read. It was the time when they really discussed what was going on. What do you think about this or that in the community? This is not the Christian meal yet, but this is this Greco-Roman meal. There was someone who presided, called a symposiarch, in other words, the head of the symposium. But it could be anybody. I could say, you know, Claire, I want you to be president this evening at the meal. And you would do it for that meal, but you know, then I would say, Paul, would you do it next time? And it was, you know, it was not ordination. I mean, it was shared leadership. Many different people. They seemed to be reluctant to have it be any one person for too long. And then at these Greco-Roman meals, there were always what these scholars describe as a variety of marginal personages. That might have been women, actually, but it would surely be servants, uninvited guests, entertainers, and dogs. They specifically mention dogs, and you'll see, so you begin to think of a text like the Syrophoenician woman in Jesus, who's, you know, where she said, well, even the dogs eat the crumbs. And this is very common. This is what was happening. They had bread, and they used the bread not only to eat, but also to eat, you know, to pick up other food. Like if you've ever eaten in an Ethiopian restaurant, you use the bread as you would use a fork, and then that bread went on the floor for the happy dogs. So this description is, you know, they've discerned this from looking at archaeological sites. If ever you have been to Israel or to some of the countries in the Middle East, often you will see these rooms where clearly there had been a pattern of people reclining around the edges of the room. And then there would be in the middle, there would be entertainers, there'd be lots of singing, and these would often be bawdy songs. They wouldn't be, even when the Christians began these meals, they wouldn't necessarily be singing hymns. They were singing, you know, songs like Martin Luther might have sung. But they were, you know, they were really, there was a lot of lusty singing, and in some cases probably a lot of lusty behavior. The thing that's amazing is that these people who are really part of this early meals group is that they say that the behavioral patterns in a wide range of Hellenistic literature, in murals, in vases, and archaeological sites. Here's the important phrase. They are consistently found in early Christian literature. In other words, it wasn't that Christians took sort of what they thought of as a Passover meal and that became the church. It's much more accurate to say they were already part of these kinds of associational meals with this very certain order. Reclining, the supper, the libation, the long symposium where people talked and sang and really imagined new ways of being. And when they looked at that form in those Hellenistic meals, they began to read text through that lens rather than the other way around. So the meals preceded the text. Or, as Hal would say, in the beginning was the meal. And it was the meal that helped them begin to see what it might be to be people who would follow this crucified and risen Savior. So we begin to hear echoes of texts in the New Testament. Reclining, as I said, you know, was the norm. It wasn't sitting in a chair. I had always wondered, you know, how sitting in a chair. Oh, I'm sorry, you're doing this camera, aren't you? How sitting in a chair, and the woman, you know, Jesus sitting in a chair, how did her tears fall on his feet? I mean, I was trying to say, did he have his feet like way back? Well, no, he was reclining. So you begin to see all these stories in the New Testament really were shaped by this form of the meal. If Jesus were reclining and his feet were really behind him, then she was standing behind him and her tears were falling on his feet. And she washed them and dried them with her hair. That wouldn't have happened if he'd been sitting in a chair with his feet under the table. I mean, that's a small thing. But we begin to see the kind of pattern that this early meals group is talking about. They want us to see that there was this time, an extended time of really grappling with who Jesus was. It wasn't this master narrative that was just handed down so neatly. There were many people who had a give and take during this symposium time about who in the world Jesus was. What did it mean that we're worshiping someone who has been crucified as a criminal? There was much more anxiety and chaos than we sometimes are allowed to think. Reclining, also, we surely hear the Gospel of John. If we look at that part of John, chapters 13 to 17, we'll see what it meant that there was this very long period. It was really a symposium where Jesus is teaching them these last important things that he can say to them. Then we read in chapter 13:23, one of the disciples, the one whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. Simon Peter therefore motioned to him to ask Jesus of whom he was speaking, because he had just said someone was going to betray him. So while reclining next to Jesus, he asked him, "Lord, who is it?" We're going to start seeing this reclining over and over if we pay attention and we begin to hear these texts in a slightly different way. There is some evidence that Hellenistic meals also experimented with social patterns not found in the larger society. So there already was some of that going on. As I mentioned before, slaves and masters, free and slave at the same banquet, all reclining together. But once they stepped out of that space, they went back to their old patterns. It was like the meal itself provided a kind of safe space within boundaries to imagine something else. I remember reading in James Cone's books, several of them, where he talks about the significance of the black church, where the domestic worker goes into that space and becomes the superintendent of the Sunday school, or the railroad porter who goes into that space of the sanctuary and becomes the head of the board of deacons, dressed like the finest banker in town. Didn't change who these folks were when they walked out on Monday and went to their old jobs. But they began to imagine in that space that there could be a different reality. And that became a very important thing that was going on in these meals. But when you hear the order of supper, libation, symposion, we begin to hear every text about the supper of Jesus with his disciples in light of that frame. Jesus took the cup also after the supper, saying, "This cup is the new covenant." People were used to that frame. They weren't used to him saying, "This is my body." I mean, that was not familiar. But because this frame of the meal was so familiar and so well established, that the best thing about the best liturgies is that if there is enough safety in them that people feel like they can try something new. In a new space even. I mean, but even within the same space. If everything changes week after week after week after week, then people just don't know what in the world is going on? Really, I mean, they just don't know. But if if there is this frame, this is what was happening with these early believers. They understood this kind of meal frame, supper, raise the glass, and eventually that glass for the Christians was raised to Jesus Christ, not to Apollo, not to the emperor. Now that surely was a shift. And it could have been a very dangerous shift. The one thing that's interesting is that for some reason, which I'm not sure of, but the Jewish community was exempt from this salute to the emperor. Their religion was allowed to not salute the emperor. And for probably 100 years, these early Christian meals were considered to be Jewish. So they didn't get arrested for not saluting the emperor. But you can begin to hear all these texts in a very new way when you see it in the frame of these early meals. Many of them were professional organizations. Some of them were ethnic gatherings. If you think about the kinds of eating that is done in churches to kind of preserve ethnic heritage, sometimes this has been really troubling for our Lutheran church because not everybody really wants to remember lutefisk or whatever it is, and it keeps us too ethnically tied. But what was happening at the time of the first and second centuries, Rome was really trying to assimilate everybody. Be like us, be part of the empire, or know your status within the empire or outside of the empire, but don't keep thinking of yourselves as Parthians and Medes and Elamites and people of Mesopotamia. So it's a very important thing that all those people get named in the Pentecost story. Because they were not, they at least still had some kind of ethnic identity. So one of the things that happened with these meals is that some of them became times to really honor their own ethnic background at a time when Rome was trying to wipe it out. So when the Christians began to have meals together, they really wanted to have a kind of distinctiveness based within the safety of the meal, that they saw themselves in a new way. These early believers had to think outside the walls because the walls were no more. But what happens to us now that we live inside those walls? And we spend a lot of money maintaining those walls. And it's probably our biggest expense as church to keep those walls from falling down. Having been a pastor in Manhattan in a church that was built in 1929, and everything inside had that vintage, from the boiler to the roof. It takes a lot to keep our walls up. Can we, though, experiment with new forms of being church? Taking a cue from what these early sisters and brothers were doing. I think it can be very helpful when we talk to people in our congregations about new places that we might experience church, whether it is, we used to meet in an Indian restaurant when I was a pastor. We met on Wednesday nights at an Indian restaurant near the church, and our goal was to just really engage the text. That was a very simple form of church. But church happened there. It wasn't just a study. Something happened there to the people who were there. And it surely happened to me as a pastor. And I would say that became a kind of sacred meal space. The church where I am now in Minneapolis, where I'm a member, on the second Sunday of the month, the young adults, millennials mainly, of the church gather at Espresso Expo on the corner near the church and really have a kind of sacred conversation. Lots of questions. They meet with some leader, but the leader changes every time. So if people have questions about why in the world you would do this, we have a perfectly good church, right? Well, maybe not perfectly good, but we have a building. Why would you go somewhere else? I think we can at least say, well, look at what was happening at the time that these early believers were trying to make sense of things. And some of us are trying to make sense of things too. So it's important for us to have some space to do that may be a little different from the church building, where some of us are afraid to ask questions here. We don't ask questions here because we want things to be certain here. We don't get sad here because we think you're supposed to be happy here. So, I think there are lots of reasons for finding different spaces. Rosemary Ruther, years ago in a book called Women Church, she's a church historian, so in the very beginning of that book, she says there are two things that the church, as an organization, at its polity, the church is supposed to be structured to do. And the first one, she says, is to pass on the traditions from one generation to another so that people don't forget. But the second is to be open to the spirit by which those traditions come alive. And she does a quick review of church history and said you can see where the church tipped too far to one side or the other. So charismatic and on fire that they didn't set up any institutions, and within a generation they died. But so rigid and resistant to anything new that they needed finally a reformation to finally find a space for the Spirit to come in and renew the church. I think we're not talking about getting rid of the walls here. Sometimes it may be necessary to retain the box in order to think outside the box. So I'm a kind of believer in the importance of the church. So I'm not going to suggest that we get rid of church or worship, but that we begin to think of expanding our vision of what we can do. One of the things that we found it helpful to do at Union in terms of talking about language, rather than talk about inclusive language, which became a lightning rod. And it is in the political campaign, really. PC is just disdained by some candidates. But we began to talk instead about expansive language rather than inclusive language. Expansive means you don't get rid of, you don't erase the classical language of the church, but you add to it. In the same way that wonderful Cecil Mullins, who was on facility staff at Union, he used to pray, "O God, thou art our mother and our father, our sister and our brother. Thou art our all in all." That's expansive language. You are baptized in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, one God, mother of us all, is expansive language. We hear the tradition, but we hear something new. So this is, I think, what these supper clubs allowed to happen. They had a frame that was familiar, but within that frame, something new was beginning to happen. We hear Karen King's questions in light of these suppers. What if the beginning of the church was a time of grappling and experimentation? What if the meaning of the gospel was not clear and Christians struggled to understand who Jesus was? So I would pose these questions from what I understand about some of these possibilities for new church spaces. Some of them will not look very different from Bible study around tables in an Indian restaurant. It will not be so unusual. Some of them may be very, very different. But here are some questions that are on my mind about what we mean by these new spaces. What are the cultural spaces where new conversations can happen? It may be pubs. It may be something very different. I think to be sensitive to those who are in recovery, pub theology sounds like a really bad idea. So just to be mindful, what are those other cultural spaces that we might consider? Does pub theology appeal primarily to white, middle-class people? Some of you are thinking of that already. I think it is a question to ask. who comes to a pub, which people come to this particular pub. What are other places that might be more welcoming than a pub? Is a coffee house better? There are some people that the last thing they want to do is sit around and talk to other people. We had an experience when I was at Advent in Manhattan, and former Bishop Hansen came to preach, and he's a powerful preacher. He's become very committed in recent years now to trying to engage more people. If you've heard him preach, he wants people to, respond and not just sit there. So he said, I want you now to turn to your neighbor and say, what you expected the Holy Spirit to do this morning. Really, I could see people looking terrified. Because they didn't really know what the Holy Spirit was, maybe, and they surely hadn't thought about that question. So, some people, I think, aren't looking for that kind of conversation in a small group, in a pub, in a coffee house, in congregations. They want to be inspired rather than, have to think too hard about something. So just to be mindful of these, what gets in the way when we think about having church in a different way and in a different space. But I do also, I'm really, because when I was at Union, for the last 12 years, since 2003, we've had a service, the first, well, it jumps around, but it's once a month, a service called At Table, which is based on a Greco-Roman meal, as much as you can do in half an hour. But it has a supper, which students make. It's like a bowl of soup. And then it has some kind of a libation. It's usually apple juice. And then a symposium where people actually talk about a question that has emerged from a story that one of the leaders has told. So it might be a story about something very scary, and then talk to one another at your tables now about a time when you were really scared and somebody came to help you. I can't remember if that was actually one, but it was a question that every table had. And the people, it was usually not a question that everybody, you could surely pass. You didn't have to talk if you didn't want to, but it was a way that everybody could be involved in the conversation. And I have wondered since then, is there a way, how might Sunday worship incorporate elements of early Christian meals? Other than just the eating and drinking, which many of us do Sunday by Sunday, but given the dangers of our spaces, not dangers, but the limitations of our spaces, when we're pews on rows of pews, even the limitations of our spaces, is there a way that some of these elements of early Christian meals could be incorporated on Sunday? Also, how can social media be a space where people, especially those afraid to speak, can speak in a way that they might not be able to in a pub or in a coffee shop? I've talked to faculty people who now are doing a lot of their courses online, which I thought, well, this is really awful. But one of the things that they've said as a positive thing is that students who are very shy can shine. They really, they can add comments, whereas if they were in the classroom, they would be probably reticent to speak up. So those are some of the questions. Maybe we can ask Brian too, about some of the questions that I have about pub theology. I think is also not exactly, doesn't mean you have to go to a pub. It's a much broader kind of term than that. But is it class-based? Is it ethnically based? Is it open to all kinds of people, no matter where they are? I think that the early Christian meals model of a frame that gives enough safety to experiment is what we're really talking about. So I'm very happy to be here because I think that it's a very exciting time to be the church. I live in a city filled with Lutherans. And That wasn't always true. I used to live in a city filled with Roman Catholics and atheists or agnostics. But I think many similarities are there in both places. I see now in my city, in St. Paul and Minneapolis, a church that has a Celtic worship service one Sunday night a month, with Julian pipes, music from Ireland, this in a Swedish Lutheran church. Most of the people who come to that service are not part of the congregation. They come because they're searching, and Celtic is as close as they can get. They come to light candles, they come to worship, they come to hear this music and readings, which are sometimes from a whole variety of different traditions, not all Christian. I think of a new congregational start in Seattle, which is one of the things they do to at least reach people, is that one of the pastors teaches yoga on Monday nights, something I would not be able to do. But it's a way for her to really meet new people it's actually in a setting that's right off the street in their church, so people can see through these glass windows that people are doing yoga there. I think of another church in Seattle, very traditional Sunday night vespers at St. Mark's Cathedral, all in candlelight, no PowerPoint, nothing that looks like the office, nothing that looks like classrooms. Thousands of young adults have been part of that service for many years, in the church, within the walls, but really reaching out to people that had not been part of church before. I think all of us could name those places where something is happening. Maybe the cultural space is the barber shop. Maybe the cultural space is a coffee shop. Maybe it's a pizza place. Maybe it's really within your walls and trying to do something that you've never done before. Is there a place where people feel safe enough to experiment with doing something new and honoring the questions that we've never allowed people to ask? I think that's the wonder of what we're doing here these couple of days. So I look forward to talking about all of these things with you. Thanks very much.